Happy to be here. And I want to introduce to you our keynote, Mannys Fombu, who actually just came in from New York. So we're very happy to have him here. Dr. Fombu is an internationally recognized authority on the convergence of digital technologies in healthcare. He's an award-winning and best-selling author, physician, keynote speaker, investor, entrepreneur, and medical futurist. I don't know how he does it all at the same time, but he's got a lot of energy, I think. Anyway, Manny has written 2 books, and he's going to talk to us about the future of healthcare, which I'm excited to hear about. So, Manny, you have 20 minutes, and then we'll leave a couple minutes for questions after he's done talking.
This is a physician-run conference. Extra low budget. Well, so my name, I'm Emmanuel Fombu. I don't know how I ended up in digital health, but basically background, I was clinical practice, and then went rogue a little bit. Did some work in private equity firms, did a startup, a gym, right? And then came back worked for Novartis, running the cardiovascular group on the medical side, and then led digital health and business development. Did several trials there, which I'll share some of that data here. And then I moved over to Johnson & Johnson, where I was the global head for the commercial strategy and digital innovation. So kind of be on the front line of big pharma, and then now I'm a rogue again. Still out. All right, so we'll start off by talking about this concept of, was anyone in this room outside of Jim born with Emmanuel? Right? I'm sure we look at a lot of physicians here, right? So we have InnovatorMDs, right? Was anyone born with Emmanuel? No, right? No, clearly. But if you go down to the car dealership or you buy a car, you get a manual, right? If you get an iPad, you get a manual. Someone has an iPad, that's good, right? If you go to IKEA, you also get a manual, right? You don't have to necessarily build the right way, right? But at least you have some kind of directions. But what happens today is in healthcare, we have no such thing, right? We don't have there's no roadmap to actually guide people when it comes to healthcare, right? Nothing. And so one of the most common questions that happens as physicians is when you see a patient, you ask the patient, you make you fill out these forms. Do you have a family history of this, right? That's a very common question people ask. And so that is my grandmother there. I think you know my grandmother, right? Actually, it's interesting. The first time I'm giving a talk when someone knows my grandmother in the room. Because I happen to have my friend Bertrand over there. We actually went to high school together. We've known each other since we were 10, up to now, right? So went to all boys school in Cameroon. And so that's my grandmother. And my grandmother grew up in a small village in Cameroon. And when she grew up, she wasn't educated, like most women in her time, right? She sold tomatoes on the side of the road in a little town in Cameroon where the high school was. And my grandmother, if you know something about Cameroon outside of how great we are in soccer, we also make very good cigar wrappers, right? We smoke cigars, make great wrappers and cigars. And so my grandmother enjoyed all of those things, right? And she was also very superstitious in her time. And she passed away, I think about 15 years ago in Washington, D.C. And my grandmother died. When she died, she had diabetes, she had hypertension for years, and she had heart failure, right? She died from heart failure. And I remember right before she died, I went to visit her, and she was home, and she had her veins all distension, neck, she couldn't breathe, difficulty breathing. And I told her, let's go to the hospital, and she said, no, let's go see a psychic. Right, she believed that's she was there was some cursing happening, right? And I actually drove her all the way down to a psychic, and I refused to pay this psychic $40, right, for this. So I was like, no, we're going to the hospital, right? We went to the hospital, and that was actually our last journey to the hospital, and that was Washington, D.C. So she died in the Washington, D.C. area, but that's my grandmother's story. That's my mother. The second part, my mom retired about 3 years ago, and she moved to Cameroon, right? And actually, the last time I was in Cameroon, he was in Cameroon, right? We all met my mom in Douala, right? We had some food down in Cameroon. Actually, last time was 2 years ago. And my mom moved back, and my mom is in her late 60s, but guess what? She gets up every day and she exercises. She goes jogging. She's very fit still, right? She's down in Orlando right now, but she has no history of diabetes or hypertension or heart failure. So if my mom was to go to a doctor and they say, hey, do you have a family history of diabetes or hypertension? And she says yes, how relevant is that to my mother? Right? Is it genetic or was it environmental? Was it educational status? It's completely different, right? My mom spent her most adult life in the US. She grew up differently, right? She's more educated. She got a doctorate degree. It's completely different. In my case, I have two younger sisters. We're all physicians. And if you look at me, for example, and you ask me, do you have a family history of diabetes or hypertension? What do I say? Do I say yes or no? And if I say yes, how relevant is that, right? It could be relevant or not. But what puts me at risk of disease? Those are some of the questions that I think are relevant across healthcare that would never actually get answered across time, right? So with that being said, if you look here in China in 1980, the rate of diabetes in China in 1980 was about 0.67%. Look at 2011, we have 9.7%. What happened in China during that period? Did the genes change? Did something happen there? No, people got wealthier, right? McDonald's, correct. As you get wealthier, people start eating a lot more junk food, right? And if you look at a lot of developing countries, it's direct opposite problem, right? In places like Cameroon, for example, where you have, I see David back there too, or Senegal, right? Where if you go, the poor people actually have access to organic, healthy foods, right? Meanwhile, the wealthier people are eating junk and canned food, they're eating pizza, right? It's the direct opposite of what we face in the Western world. But you can see the rates of disease that happens. And there's a company in China called iCarbonX. Anyone heard of iCarbonX? Correct? So recently they made the news because they put over $100 million into patients like me, right? And Trump forced them to give the money back. And so, yes, no one heard about it? Anyone hear about this? Yeah, so Patients Like Me was a platform where patients would go on and talk about how they feel. You talk about your symptoms, like a social media site, right, for patients. And Patients Like Me started raising a lot of money and it became very valuable. So a Chinese company called iCarbonX came in and said, hey, let me give you a couple $100 million and I'll be your main shareholder. Why do they care? Because they were looking at what's happening in the West and they were building products in China to prevent disease. That was their interest. They were taking insights from West American data and building companies back in China. But then Trump said, well, a Chinese-based company cannot own over 50% of any US company. So then they were forced to return the money to China, and the company got acquired by United Healthcare. That's the next topic of conversation, right? So that's in China, but let's come back to the US. Has anyone been to St. Louis, Missouri? Clearly, everyone is fancy around here except four of us, right? If you go to St. Louis, Missouri, they have something beautiful called toasted ravioli, if you want, I've been there, right? So, but in St. Louis, there's a street called Delmar Boulevard that splits the city into north and south. The northern part of the city, as you can tell, is basically like the hood, if you want to call it the hood, right? The southern part is the wealthy part of the city. People are more educated, and you can see the numbers there for yourself. The rates of cardiovascular disease and cancers are 7 times higher in the northern part of that line than in the southern part of that line, in the exact same city, okay? So basically, for my story, when I described my grandmother, for example, what side of the line? My grandmother is in the northern part of the line, right? She wasn't educated, right? She was low income. She fits directly in that space, right? Most of us here most likely fit at the bottom part. Guess where all the doctor's offices are? In the red part or the blue part? Correct. Everyone, all the hospitals are down here. There's nothing up there, right? If you go up north, what you find is what? More liquor stores, right? Check cashing places, fried chicken, right? Like recently, you could see people kill each other over Popeye's chicken sandwich, right? That became things that was on the news, right? That's exactly what happens in this particular case. And so this is something that is beyond genetics, right? The genes in the exact same city were not somehow skewed towards the northern part being disease-driven. These are environmental factors. I'm not saying that genes don't play a role, but environmental, socioeconomic determinants of health are relevant when it comes to healthcare, as we look at things in general. Even identical twins born when they grow up, they might look completely different, right? It doesn't mean just because you're an identical twin, you might grow up looking as great as Jim Ehrlich. Right, so if we look at chronic conditions in general, I mean, I've been in drug development for a long time in pharma, and you realize that it's a massive issue, right? It's a $47 trillion problem. And when we talk about chronic diseases, We talk about cardiovascular disease, COPD, cancer, diabetes, and mental health, right? Those are major issues that are very expensive. And this is a $47 trillion problem, so it's massive. That's why when you look at healthcare, you see everyone jumping in, like digital health, and is AI overrated, or is blockchain, and everyone talks about it because it's a massive market, right? Everyone's like, hey, how do we solve this? How do we change behavior? But how do you tackle this? From a genomic side, is it environmental, whatever it is, how do you do it? And why do we talk about this today, and why is it relevant today? So a lot of times you might hear people say, is AI overhyped or is digital health hyped? I think for the very first time in our history, all those different factors have actually merged together, right? So when I was in Novartis, for example, we developed a drug called Entresto that we launched in the market. The market predicted this would be a blockbuster drug of $4 billion in sales in the first year. And we came in and we kind of flopped a little bit in the market. And the question around that was, but why? Because insurance companies are not paying anymore for random studies. So when we do studies, and I'll talk about that later, we don't design them in an optimal way that reflects the real world, right? And so insurance companies are thinking differently now. And healthcare is changing, the environment is changing, where we need to leverage technologies around to control behavior to actually get better outcomes. And I'll show some examples with you. And so talking about clinical research, when we design research, we have this beautiful thing called inclusion, exclusion criteria, right? So if you want to do a study in hypertension, for example, you find the perfect patients, right? Perfect BMI, perfect blood pressures that just barely cross the line, like, optimal patient. Why? Because you want to tell the FDA my drug works, right? It's a controlled environment. But guess what? When you launch that drug in the market, do you only give that drug to those kind of patients? No, because the real world looks like that, right? The real world is completely different, right? So payers are saying, if you do your study in that perfect world over there, I'm only going to give the drug to those patients, right, in that world. Or you could do your research in this world, which is why you start hearing the new term real world evidence, right? Everyone talks about real world evidence, but no one will ever do a study in the real world. Do you think anyone will do a study in the real world where you don't control variables and look at p-value? No, right? We have to move from p-values into more confidence interval kind of relationships, right? Or relationship kind of discussions. But the FDA is not flexible around that. The FDA is stuck on p-values, right? So because of that, we have PAs, right? Prior authorizations, you have to call and bother the insurance companies because they want you to show data sets that work there, right? So you see a lot of digital health companies coming up. Don't just think about it from a robotic point of view. What is happening is technology makes it possible to actually generate data in the real world that you could show the insurance company the drug works more. And you could do value-based contracts. So the hospitals, doctors, so pharmaceutical companies go reimburse more. So this is happening today. So it's not futuristic for the way you look at it. These are real world ways in which you could do this. Does anyone know this gentleman? Yeah, we got some French people in here. You know this guy? So this guy, he's a French lawyer. His name is Jean-François Raffray. And Jean-François Raffray, in 1956, he was 46 years old, right? He lives in the south of France. And at the time, the French government put in a new rule that if you found an elderly person in the apartment and you paid their rent, when they died, you owned their property. At the time, the life expectancy of women in the south of France was 74.8 years old, okay? And so, going around, he found Marie Calment. That's her name. So at the time, she was 90 years old, at home. She smokes and drinks port wine. She's been drinking every single day and smokes every single day, right? That's actually a picture of her. And she was 90 years old. Life expectancy, 74.8, 90. You think it's a good deal? Good deal, good. So he picked her and he paid her rent, right? 33 years later. Guess who died first? He was dead and she was still alive. And so what happened was, by the time he died, he had paid twice the value of that apartment and he never lived in it. Fast forward, she's the longest living human that ever lived. She lived to 122 years, right? By default. And so this brings things into perspective of how we look at medicine today when we do research with these mass populations, right? And then we try to make conclusions on people, right? So I did a study with on 1,000 patients, and it showed that my drug works for diabetes, right? By a p-value of 0.048, right? And then you go, pop, every patient with diabetes takes the drug, right? It doesn't mean it works for everyone, and we know that, right? We just give, oh, it doesn't work, let's try another medication. Let's increase the dose. That's what we do in medicine, right? It's just playing Russian roulette. If one works, great. If it doesn't work, increase the dose. That's what we do. So technology is taking things away from this thing and say, hey, let's make it personalized, right? Let's not make these generalized rules that apply to every single person, but let's understand you as an individual, right? Everything is becoming individualized today. If you have Netflix, for example, your video content is completely different from mine, right? Even if you live in the same household, it's completely different. So that's where healthcare is going. It's the kind of mindset that we're going into predicting things, right? By probability. That's what artificial intelligence is, right? Just prediction. It's not this crazy idea of robots doing crazy things, even though I have colleagues in here doing robotic surgery, doing meetings. What was that? I have 5 more hours? Okay, thanks. But thanks to do it. And so today in healthcare, we're doing this thing where people get sick and you go to your doctor and your doctor says, hey, why don't you go home? And if the symptoms get worse, then come back, right? If you come back, great. If you don't, oops, missed you, right? And we go into this new world of medicine where it's more predictive, right? We understand the risk for disease, and we can actually do things ahead of time to predict and prevent disease, as opposed to be more reactive. It's a way of being more proactive about healthcare. And I think that's what technology can do today. And if we do that, we could definitely generally decrease cost. This is a very interesting study of thing that brought me back into big pharma, where I was shocked about how we actually look at quality of life. Today, we do quality of life in clinical studies by making patients fill out all these questionnaires, right? Tell me how you felt 2 weeks ago. Were you active 2 weeks ago, last week? I can't even tell you how I felt last night, right? But this is what we do. And so at the time, I was thinking, is it better for us to use Fitbits and Apple Watches to actually make objectively look at quality of life? Why do I need to ask if you were active the last month? I look at your activity trends, right? And so I joined Novartis and I actually did a study called Awake. We just published this in Journal of Cardiac Failure. And we did the very first study in heart failure patient population using this watch made by Philips to actually look at activity and sleep. So we could tell when someone goes to bed at night and when they woke up and look at sleep patterns and how that relates to quality of life. And in the study, we had one patient that died, right? And we're just looking at baseline without ECGs. We realized that 4 days before she died, there was no difference between her daytime activity and nighttime activity. It's like continuous movement, just basic activity. And we realized that we're able to predict atrial fibrillation and strokes. Right, so if you look at just the baseline activity data, you could actually see patterns, right? Just change from baseline kind of patterns. And so because of that, I kind of quit my job at Novartis and I went over to Johnson & Johnson. Who can guess why? I thought you were answering the question. What? ISIS? It's a bad time killer. ISIS, no. No, because Novartis did not have a drug for AFib or stroke. Xarelto is a Johnson & Johnson drug, right? So from a business model, it makes sense to predict. And so I went over and we did the deal with Apple. So you know the Apple Watch atrial fibrillation thing? So that came from the original study that we did. And we get the deals done. So you see this is the first kind of trend where you look at just baseline changes you could predict. And so people spend their time, if you go on LinkedIn or you go to groups, everyone is arguing about specificity of the test. And people have these debates. Do you think as a drug seller, no drug dealer, sorry. A legal drug dealer. I pay taxes. It's a legalized drug dealer, right? We're all drug pushers, right? Prescriptions, you're a drug pusher too, right? So we just pay taxes and we have papers that do it. Right? Anyways, but if you look at it from the concept of sensitivity and specificity, does it matter to me? No, it doesn't, right? Because actually, if my specificity is low and I have a high sensitivity, I don't care because more people go to the doctors, right? And out of 100 people, maybe 50 more people would take my drug that would not have without this. So it's a completely different argument on both sides of the business, right? And so you see a lot of these happening, which is not based on science. It's based on the concept of can I most likely predict. So you will see people come up with these kind of things where they will never give a diagnosis. Let the doctor make a diagnosis, but let's flood the doctor with a lot of things. We'll flood you, and you would just be more aware of disease more often. And after that, we do TV commercials, right? Between both of them, you write the prescription. See the idea for business model. So it's not necessarily be focused on the science piece of it or being like that driven from that angle. I will kind of skip a little bit since I already have a short amount of time. This company here is something we worked on about 5 years ago. It's called Butterfly Network. Anyone familiar with Butterfly? Correct. So several years ago, we partnered with Butterfly, and you know what Butterfly does, right? That's a portable ultrasound. We trained this with a lot of data sets from Uganda, right? If you don't know, in the US it's very difficult to get data sets, but hearts in Uganda looks like hearts in the US sometimes, right? If you check them, right? So did a training there, and today you have this product in the market. When we started talking about this, it was a general idea. We didn't have any specific areas, but now things like this are in the market today, right? You can see Uganda, where even someone that is not trained in medicine is able to actually do a full echo, right? Clearly from this. How much time?
30 seconds.
Okay, voice also is a new biomarker as well. This is the last piece, I'll leave you here. But voice is also a new marker. So forget about the typical digital tracker. So voice is very important. We've done work with voice where you could use voice to predict Alzheimer's, dementia, right? We've done voice with suicide prediction models from voice. And United Healthcare, especially now, is collecting data sets when you call your insurance company. They're collecting those voice data points. And in the future, when you call your insurance company, they could quote your insurance quote based on your voice and risk for disease. Right? So this is not futuristic. There are companies that are out there today that are being funded that are working specifically on voice and technology. And so my last slide is all yours, and I'll drop the mic, right? The concept, what I'm trying to say is when we're all born, right, our gene is like this, sets this foundation, right? Just a baseline. But life in general is a complete story. And the decisions we make on each and every day puts us at a higher risk or a lower risk for disease, right? And so whether you drink less wine or you get more active or you do things, that would definitely improve your outcomes of disease. And as physicians in the audience, I'm hoping that if we get this mindset of being more proactive with healthcare, we could do this and make sure that our patients live longer and healthier lives. So thank you. I don't know. You sure?
So actually, we have a couple. I've been told that we have a couple minutes for questions for Manny, since he really gave us a tour de force of what a lot of the future holds for healthcare. Does anyone have any specific questions?
Are you convinced?
Absolutely. Actually, so it's interesting. So that ultrasound that he showed. So at Stanford, we have all the physicians have money like that they can use to buy technology, et cetera. So we're actually allowed to buy that. So some of the anesthesiologists are walking around with their little portable ultrasounds.
Yes. No, Jim.
Anyway, I don't have a question, but I do have a fun fact or two that I learned by talking to Bertrand here, who went to high school with him. Fact number one, and I asked Bertrand this, turns out, surprising answer, he did graduate high school. Number two is he was always taller than Bertrand, even in high school. So those are just fun facts for the group, he said.
Quick question here on the data sets kind of drive the outcome of how good these AI innovations, digital health innovations are. And you mentioned it's hard to get good data sets in the US. Are we heading towards a future where the US is going to have to buy all of our AI innovations or AI data sets or algorithms from outside of the US itself? Or how do you see that sorting out?
That's interesting, actually. I think we have pretty good data sets in the US. I think the difference is we have players that are trying to control the data sets. Right, and it's not a lack of data sets. It's actually a lot of data, but people control it. So if you go to within EHRs, right, whether it's Epic or Cerner, you want to control that. Or Fitbit has its own data. Google has its own data, right? And no one actually has a centralized piece of data. So I think so if you go to a place like Uganda, for example, you can literally completely just leapfrog, right? If you go to Rwanda, actually I was in Rwanda with David. You don't work in Rwanda, right? Where you can literally leapfrog and do something directly without having to go through all these barriers. If you want to do an EHR system, you can literally launch something within a hospital system in Rwanda and do it. And because of that, I think if you look at a place like China, for example, where the right to privacy doesn't exist, and you know it doesn't exist. I mean, I think it doesn't exist even here, but we just pretend that we think it exists, right? But I think that brings up a new debate. I think in that direction where it goes is data ownership kind of debates, right? Who owns data? And I think it's a data ownership question. I think that's the future of that. Dr. Ayman has a question. Oh. I just put you in the spot, right? That's a question.
Give him a hard question. So, for all the medical literature that's available, it's kind of predictive, right? So we do all these studies to know, like, if I get an acute subdural hematoma in my practice, I know that 60% of the patients will die and 40% will survive, right? So we did all that hard work in the medical literature over the past, 60 or 80 years to be predictive about the diseases that we know about, right? So for AI, looking into the future of AI, is it more personalized or it's more public health? Where do you see the future?
In reality or in fantasy land? You want the real world example, or you want the inclusion criteria world? The saddest thing in medicine is after we do all the research and we have all the evidence, we unfortunately don't control the outcomes, right? We don't. Insurance companies determine what happens, right? Which is the sad part where we could have all the data sets to say, hey, eating junk food and blah, blah, blah leads to heart disease, and guess what? No one closes any KFC spot, it's still open, right? It doesn't matter what we say, right? I think we get to a point where I predict companies like Amazon, for example, will sell insurance in open market, right? So if you see Tugawande, for example, is there, right? And you see Amazon buying Whole Foods, right? Amazon buys PillPack, for example, right? To go to generic market piece where it's not necessarily driven by evidence, right? It's outcomes driven. So who goes to, was an Amazon Prime member? Most likely someone that lives in San Francisco that does yoga, right? It's a completely different, healthier kind of person. And so if Amazon gets their Prime members in and they give you your food and deliver generic drugs to you, they could sell insurance for your open market. And so what will happen in that particular case is it's going to literally split society up in a point where people that are higher risk will just not be covered, right? And that's where we're going in. That's the direction where healthcare is going, and it's kind of scary, where people have to be more proactive. And so at that point, we have no choice but to have this personalized medicine approach where people own their right, their own health, and they'll do more things to be proactive.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Manny.
Thank you.